May I speak in the name of our loving, liberating, and life-giving God. Amen. Please be seated. Rosa Louise was born in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1913. Her mother worked as a teacher and her father as a carpenter, and theirs was, unfortunately, not a happy union. When they separated while she was still a young child, she moved with her mother and younger brother to the family farm just outside of Montgomery, where she attended rural schools for much of her life and grew close to her much-beloved grandparents. Rosa Louise was small and often sick. She was bullied by her classmates. On top of that, it was a restless time in the American South, and nightly the streets outside her home were threatened by bands of lawless vigilantes. Looking back on these years, though, it seemed the greatest indignity as the child of people who really valued education was seeing a school bus full of healthy, happy children pass her by each morning. Public funding provided buses to white schools, but not to hers. So she and her classmates walked. What else were they to do? In 1932, she married, and in 1933, she became one of the less than 7% of African Americans in the country at the time to earn a high school diploma. 10 years later, she joined an organization dedicated to the advancement of colored people, despite her boss saying, "Women don't need to be nowhere but in the kitchen," and also got connected to a nascent community organizing group focused on students. By the mid-1950s, she'd attended an educational program for civil rights activists in Tennessee. A few months later, Emmett Till, a young black teenager, was brutally murdered in Mississippi after reportedly flirting with a white woman. Despite all her work and the work of her friends, the two men accused of the crime still walked free, despite admitting they had taken the boy. She was grief-stricken and enraged. Just 4 days later, she started disobeying the strict bus segregation laws in Montgomery. She boarded from the front, and when told she needed to exit, walked. She boarded from the front and took a seat in the white section, and when told she needed to exit, did. But a few months later, in December of the same year, she was tired, so she took a seat in the colored section. She didn't realize that the driver was one who had been offended by her previous protests, her practice runs and rehearsals, if you will, until the bus started filling up with white customers, and he stood to move the colored row sign back one in order to make room for them. She recalled years later that in that moment, she felt a determination cover her body like a quilt on a winter night. Perhaps by now you've realized that Rosa Louise is more widely known as Rosa Parks, a hero, a civil rights leader, a visionary. But she was also Rosa Louise, a 42-year-old woman with a family and a story who made choices and mistakes, a woman embedded in a wider and highly organized community who had been trained and prepared for an opportune moment if ever it presented itself. When, on December 1st, 1955, it did, she recalls that she was tired physically. It had been a long day, a long week, a long life, but she was much more tired psychologically, tired of giving in. She knew the consequences of staying put when the driver moved that sign. She had trained for them, like a marathon runner or a cadet. She was in good shape. But today is not the feast of the Reverend Dr. Rosa Parks. It's the feast of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a saint and martyr of the church, the most clearly recognized leader of the civil rights movement. So why start with Rosa's story? Because Martin and Rosa, before being MLK and Rosa Parks, were people, proud and particular, wounded and wonderful, They were people who made decisions and loved their families and strayed and asked for help and prayed, prayed, prayed. They were people who'd been hurt by other people, who grieved other people, who lived with countless daily injustices and disappointments, people who had studied and trained and practiced their many and varied acts of civil disobedience. When I first learned about these two in public school in suburban Ohio, I thought they were untouchable, so beyond the realm of normal as to make their example an inspiration, but also beyond my ever so limited reach. This shifted for me in my final year of seminary, when I took a class on the theological underpinnings of the civil rights movement. After all, Martin Luther King was not only a hero and an activist, he was a reverend and a doctor. He had been trained and formed not only by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress for Racial Equality and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but also by Morehouse College, Crozier Theological, and Boston University. In my final paper for that class, I explored how our tendency to focus on the heroes of the civil rights era actually limits and can even diminish our understanding of how the wider movement affected change. We erect statues to honor leaders whose stories we don't really know. We focus on exceptional individuals instead of the complex and controversial institutions from which they emerge. We celebrate Martin Luther King, an American hero, while generally disparaging the radical faithfulness he commended to us. Love your enemies, Martin said, echoing Jesus in today's gospel. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Even when they segregate you, even when they subject you to violence and intimidation, even when they tell you to give up your seat. How inconvenient, we might think to ourselves. How impractical, if not impossible. How, frankly, offensive to our egos and our pride and our own sense of righteous indignation. And if we think of the leaders of justice movements as superheroes, super saints, martyrs with supersized hearts, we don't feel so bad giving up on this daunting ideal, this challenging invitation. Surely God does not expect us to be so prodigal with our kindness, so generous with our mercy, so wasteful with our love. And so a day like today challenges us with a very simple question. But what if God does? What if this challenging call is not just for people like them, but for people like us? What if projecting onto a few a kind of perfect faithfulness blinds us to the countless others who tumbled and stumbled, strayed but stayed, whose daily acts of courage and commitment were as inspired and as inspiring as the ones that ultimately turned the tides of history? Darnell Moore is a contemporary strategist and activist, and author of the 2018 book, No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age Black and Free in America. He's been educated by Seton Hall University and Princeton Theological Seminary, and now is affiliated with USC, Columbia University, and Breakthrough, a global human rights organization. He also says he's been profoundly shaped by the popular and academic feminist, queer, anti-colonial, and anti-racist schools of thought. He too criticizes this idea that a movement is primarily about its mythical leader, and as such, challenges readers and students and citizens in general to investigate the institutions we admire and those we're suspicious of, the movements we find compelling and those we find alarming. Race and racism have become a heated topic once again in our national dialogue. Our issues are different than they were for Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and their countless contemporaries. Instead of segregated schools and segregated buses and Jim Crow and redlining, we face mass incarceration and segregated neighborhoods and concerns over gerrymandering and calls for reparations. We're divided over how to ensure equal access to higher education and the C-suite, if and when to remove statues and take down flags, whether reverse racism is a real thing or just plain old racism taken to the extreme. We're divided about how to tell the story of our history and who we can trust as we lean into our future. And people on every side all too often feel misunderstood and misrepresented. Which is why telling truer and fuller stories about where we've come from is so important. Those conversations might be hard and uncomfortable, awkward and challenging, but what meaningful part of our lives isn't occasionally hard and uncomfortable and awkward and challenging? Maybe if we remember that Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King were so much a part of SNCC, and that SNCC was sympathetic to that ever so controversial Communist Party, and that it was also rather patriarchal and filled with brilliant and angry and complicated people, while still staying focused on a worthy goal, a daunting dream. We could tell ourselves different stories about organizing groups today. We might be able to listen to and tell ourselves different stories about groups like Black Lives Matter, which at least some people, like Darnell Moore, see as trying to be this different kind of movement. Stories that focus on our dreams instead of simply our disagreements. Which is perhaps what makes a people, not just Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, but the countless other children of God of all races and ages and faiths, a movement, not simply a collection of disorganized, exceptional people. They shared a dream, a dangerous dream, but an inspired dream, of freedom from oppression and the ties that bind, of liberty and equality and justice, in a country that had not yet given anyone reason to think this was possible. There's a saying that we don't know what we don't know. A community organizer with the Industrial Areas Foundation, the nation's oldest and largest network of faith-based and other institutions, describes how when he asks parents in economically depressed urban centers what they want for their children's schools, what they dream for their children's schools, they almost unanimously say two things. One, safety, meaning security guards and metal detectors in closed campuses. And two, discipline. Objectively, safety and discipline are good. Nothing wrong there. But when this group takes those same parents to vibrant schools where children are flourishing and then asks them the same question, it becomes clear that those parents actually want much more for their children. They want music and beautiful spaces and time outside. They want teachers interested in being mentors. They want science labs and STEM programs. But until they saw these things, they didn't know that's what they wanted. They didn't know their dream could be so lavish. This is the gift we need both individuals and institutions to pass down and raise up and share across time. The gift of seeing what is not yet, of helping one another imagine a way forward into a better and brighter and more beautiful tomorrow. It might be a hard road, but it also promises to be a great adventure. I'm not exactly sure where it will lead, but the dreamers at the heart of our celebration today, Jesus, Martin, and countless others, say it has something to do with self-giving love, something to do with humble prayer, something to do with kindness, something to do with practicing mercy. I wonder what we might discover if we realized this is also an invitation for each of us and decided even in some small way, to respond. Amen.